As Erica mentioned, my name is Tim Runge. I'm a professor of psychology at Indiana University of Pennsylvania. I teach in a school psych training program. We have a master's program and a doctoral program. Joining me today are 3 current students from our school psych programs, and they'll be coming up here momentarily. Katie Mazer is currently interning at Quaker Valley School District outside of Pittsburgh. And I'm just going to go in order of how they're sitting here. Caitlin Pike is a second-year doctoral student who will be looking for a school psych internship in 2 years. And then Amber Ulrich is a school psych intern at Derry Township. So she traveled the furthest today from literally like across the street. And so she's interning as well. So Katie and Amber are looking for jobs as school psychologists next academic year. If you know of anybody who's hiring school psychs, everybody, thank you. I mean, sorry, but thank you for noting that. We have 2 young aspiring school psychologists who will be newly minted at the end of this academic year to independently practice as school psychs, and I believe they're planning on staying in the great Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And they have wonderful and rich experiences not only in the general kind of traditional role of school psych, but also in the area of program evaluative work, notably PBIS. So I have had the pleasure of doing this work for the state of Pennsylvania for the past 14, 15 years, I don't know, I lose track, with some other colleagues who aren't with us here today, namely Mark Stitskavich, who is retired and is living in Virginia, but he still helps us out on this project. And then other graduate students whose names are listed here, Casey Hoover, the last one, he's actually interning at Wellsboro School District. So he's also looking for a job. But anyhow, basically, what we have been doing for the past 15 years is aggregating all of the data across the Commonwealth to answer a variety of questions related to the process, the capacity, the fidelity, and the sexy and most glamorous part of it, the outcomes associated with PBIS implementation. If you don't like data, this would be your opportunity to go to another session, because all we're going to do is talk about data. And we're talking about data from a macro level, from a statewide level. Many of you are practitioners. I'm guessing, raise your hand if you're in the schools on a regular basis. Okay, so a few. Consultants like IU or patent people. Okay, researchers, higher ed. Parents. Nobody here has kids. That's strange. Okay, so you're not a, okay, anyhow. So what we're going to do is really talk about the data piece. And so if you're not interested in data, then I would invite you to find a much more appealing session, because all this session is about is data. Now, there is a PDF version of this on whatever Patent's event page, so you should be able to access that. And also, this executive summary is posted on the PAPBS.org website. This is a summary of a report that we generated actually a year ago, and we are in the final stages of generating the most recent one, and therefore what we're about to share with you actually are results from a couple of years ago. Our program evaluations are always a couple of years behind where we are in real time, simply because of the vast quantity of data that we gather, as well as the process of getting those data into a digestible manner that is consumable to various constituencies. And so what we're actually going to have to do today is to take a little bit of a time warp backward to some academic years that I'm imagining most of us would like to have forgotten. And that is namely that first year full after COVID, you know, when like some schools never opened for face-to-face, and other schools, at least in our area, like Monday and Tuesday, kids with last names that went from A to K. Remember those years now? And you thought you were going to be able to forget them? Sorry, we're going to have to actually talk a little bit about that, because some of the data that we are going to share with you this afternoon is related to that particular academic year. There are also a few pieces of data that we're going to share from the 21 to 22 academic year. And while much of our data is from 2021, you know, that year that we all want to forget, there are some data from the 21-22 academic year. And the reason for the difference in the years in which we are sharing data has largely a lot to do with the mechanisms behind the scenes to collect those data and then produce them in a consumable manner. And so when my students are up here presenting and they're switching between 2 academic years, just understand they're not lying to you and we're not trying to deceive you. It's just a function or a product of the different data mechanisms that we have available to us and the efficiency with which we get data and then turn around and use those data to generate our reports. The more obvious example would be the outcome data. Outcome data take a year because you got to finish an academic year before you can then enter your outcome data. And then it takes us a full year to review those data and then summarize results. And so that's why there's this time lag that appears in a lot of the work that we present. So that being said, this is the kind of the 5 broad areas that we have organized or structured our program evaluation. And Katie, Caitlin, and Amber are each going to take various sections here, so there's going to be a little bit of me sitting down and they come up, which is far more entertaining than me being up here. And then I will bop in every once in a while for a few of these sections as well. But importantly, Katie, Caitlin, and Amber, and Casey, and the other names that were listed up there had an integral role in this work. They suffered through working for me, and actually Caitlin still has to suffer by working for me, on this project. So they know these data extremely well, despite the fact that they're a little anxious about presenting formally here today. And so ask tough questions. They can answer them. But anyhow, so I'm going to turn it over to, who goes first? I don't even remember. Katie goes first, and so she's going to tell a little bit about the reach of the work that is occurring across the Commonwealth. So Katie.
Okay. I feel like this is a little too tall for me. Okay, can everyone hear me okay? All right, perfect. Okay, so as Dr. Runge mentioned, I'm going to be taking over the first area of review, which is reach. And we define reach as really the scale of the SWPBIS initiative. So it evaluates the extent to which the SWPBIS initiative reaches who it is purported to support. And REACH describes the participating schools that are involved, the community agencies that are involved, and other organizations that are all involved in the implementation of SWPBIS. Okay. So to determine the scale of the SWPBIS initiative and where any sustaining or expansion efforts should focus in the coming years, we need to ask who is participating in SWPBIS. And this is evaluated by 3 guiding questions that we seek to answer in the coming slides and also are answered within the report. Those are how many schools and districts are involved, what are the trends in PAPBS network affiliation over time, and how many collaborating agencies are involved with SWPBIS implementation. So to attempt to answer the first question, this graph depicts the number of schools disaggregated by building type that are involved and affiliated with the PAPBS network during the 2021 to 2022 academic year. And here, schools are only categorized once based on the majority of grades that are allocated within that school or in that building. So by the spring of 2022, there were a total of 2,936 schools that were in the PAPBS network, which represents an increase of 7% from the previous academic year. And consistent with the past 13 years, elementary schools are accounting for like half at 50.3% of affiliated sites, followed by high schools at 22% and middle schools at 16.9% of affiliated sites. There are much smaller proportions of schools that are pre-K through 8, pre-K through 12, and alternative schools. Pre-K through 8 schools have a proportion of 6.8% of the affiliated sites, and pre-K through 12 and alternative schools come in at 1.9% each for affiliated sites. Early childhood programs that are embedded within elementary schools and schools that are classified as other each represent less than 1% of affiliated sites. And it's important to mention here that the data are not representative of the fidelity of SWPBIS implementation. Rather, this is just simply a representation of the affiliated sites within the PAPBS network. To attempt to answer the second question, this graph depicts the cross-sectional trends in the number of SWPBIS network affiliated schools since the data were tracked in the 2011 to 2012 school year. And it's also important to note here that from the 2011 to 2012 school year to the 2013-14 school year, these data are considered to be more of a reasonable estimate due to a lack of a formalized process for determining affiliation and all that sort of stuff. So as we can see with this graph, we have a gradual upward trend in PAPBS network affiliation up until the 2018-19 academic year, where we see a very high spike, and then it remains more gradual upward for the remainder of that time. The sharp increase is potentially described by an increase in enthusiasm with being involved in the network and implementing SWPBIS as a program, as well as the more formalized process for determining affiliation. As was previously alluded to, in the spring 2022 year, affiliation was at an all-time high. And we saw this growth across all building types, but particularly there were, with elementary schools and high schools, they observed the more robust, proportionate, and relative growth with increases at 7.5% from the previous academic year. So while the number of PAPBS network affiliated schools that were reported from the 2021 to 2022 academic year, the location of the PAPBS affiliated schools are from the data from the 2020 to 2021 academic year, so that's that bit of an inconsistent piece due to the way the data was gathered. There were a total of 265 local education agencies that were affiliated in the 2021 to 2022 academic year, which accounts for 53% of all LEAs in PA. And this is just counting for traditional public schools, not schools that are like charter schools or cyber schools, private schools, etc. As you can see from the graph or the graphical display, we really have representation of PAPBS network affiliated schools across the state, with some particular concentrations in the center of the state. Finally, to answer the third question, the implementation of SWPBIS is supported by multiple community agencies that partner with PAPBS network affiliated schools. And this is really extremely helpful given the limited resources that may pose a barrier to the implementation of SWPBIS for some schools. And often those collaborating mental health agencies are local behavioral and mental health organizations and other aligned human services providers. Since the 2007 to 2008 academic year, there were a total of 484 agencies that are involved supporting the SWPBIS implementation and effort. And this represents an annual increase of 25% from the 387 agencies that were reported from the previous academic year. So overall, it has been great to see these increases in affiliation, and the hope is that this trend will continue upward in the coming years as we develop a more formalized process and we see more data coming in about SWPBIS. So I'll take it to Caitlin for process.
So the next evaluative area of implementation is defined as process, where overall we want to look at what's happening with the SWPBIS initiative. So we wanted to examine the large-scale process of SWPBIS evaluation, which is associated with the common questions of what were the leadership activities and key accomplishments of the community of practice on school-based behavioral health related to SWPBIS. How do schools become affiliated with the PAPBS network, and what does that process look like? And lastly, what professional development activities were provided across the network? So the Community of Practice on School-Based Behavioral Health is a statewide team committed to early childhood and school-age wellness in Pennsylvania, and they accomplish this by emphasizing partnerships that utilize multi-tiered logic and evidence-based practices. And there are two strategies that are employed in order to achieve that mission listed here. Strategy one being continued scale-up of the PBIS framework with fidelity through the outreach endeavors of the PAPBS network across the Commonwealth, and strategy two being alignment of evidence-based, trauma-informed approaches to build protective factors and enhance social-emotional well-being to reduce or mitigate risk factors associated with substance misuse and youth suicide in an equitable manner across programs. On their website, papbs.org, is where you can find a complete membership listing and the activities identified in those scheduled meetings. So to note some key accomplishments for the 2021-2022 academic year, those include updating network facilitator training materials to enhance social-emotional learning and PA career-ready skills, broadening data reviews to include the results of the Pennsylvania Youth Survey, reviewing mini-grant proposals, supporting operational analyses aligned with restructuring and integration of early intervention technical assistance and Office of Child Development and Early Learning, creating guidance documents regarding alignment of student assistance programs and MTSS frameworks, and reconfiguring the co-director structure and leadership of the community of practice on school-based behavioral health. When looking at becoming part of the PAPBS network, there's a formal process for LEAs and schools to become affiliated members. Things such as district and school expectations, supporting documentation, and contact information for the lead SWPBIS consultant is also found on that website. So this process would consist of agreements and commitments between the LEA, school building, the PAPBS network facilitator, the IU in which the school is located, and the regional patent PBIS consultant. When a network facilitator is then assigned to an LEA, a checklist is used to determine each building's readiness to participate. The network facilitator, building level team, and LEA would then develop an action plan and commit to a long-term training and technical assistance plan to install all tiers of SWPBIS. Regarding professional development, Patent offered a number of webinars through its behavior and MTSS initiatives. The Pennsylvania Intermediate Units provide training as well as regional and statewide trainings provided by the Patent offices, which are available on their training calendars. The state-level patent training meetings remained fully remote for this past academic year, with topics including proactive discipline approaches, addressing disproportionality, checking Connect implementation, quality indicators of emotional support services, SWPBIS implementation in secondary settings, and culturally responsive SWPBIS. The annual PAPBS Network Implementers Forum was combined with another PDE conference in a 2-day virtual event on November 10th and 11th in 2021. Day 1 was primarily dedicated to a theme of Equity is MTSS, and there were 5 breakout periods provided with 30 different sessions to choose from across various school-wide and program-wide PBIS issues, with approximately 900 people in attendance of this event. And then lastly, the statewide PAPBS Network Facilitator Summit was held virtually on September 24th, 2021. There were approximately 150 facilitators in attendance of this event, and some highlights included a review of the 2021-2022 recognition and participation application process for PAPBS network schools, given the ongoing COVID pandemic and challenges that schools face in order to meet requirements for recognition, such as fidelity measures and prior data submissions. So with that, that would tie into our Area 3 of capacity.
Okay, so we have reach in terms of the number of schools and LEAs affiliated with PAPBS network, and then we have a description of some of the professional development activities that were used to install the practices across the Commonwealth. And so what is the capacity, again, to continue this work, and then namely also what is the fidelity with which these practices were installed. When we look at capacity, we're trying to address the ability of the network to actually install SWPBIS in as many schools as possible to a high degree of fidelity. And so largely what we do is we look at the number of facilitators that are involved in this work. So recall that every LEA is assigned a network facilitator, typically an IU or a patent consultant, typically, not always, but typically. And the only way that we can actually get this work installed in schools is if we increase the capacity of folks to actually do this work, the training and technical assistance with schools. And as you can see, a cross-sectional review of the number of network facilitators demonstrates a nice gradual increase in facilitator, independently trained facilitators to do this work, upwards of 235 as of the spring of 2022, because you need facilitators to do the training and the consultative work. There also was some funding that was available at the state level through the mechanism of the school-based behavioral health grants. You will notice there were 2 years in which there were no grants provided, and I can't help but wonder if some of our similar graphs from previous years maybe spurred the need to maybe consider revisiting school-based behavioral health grant funding. And so we can see, despite the fact that there is a downward trend over a number of years, there still was a decent amount of money available to a number of schools that received those grants, which were used to both install and also sustain Tier 1 or install and sustain advanced tiers of PBIS. Up until this point, we haven't really talked about the degree with which the practice, the framework was actually installed as designed. and that's fidelity. And I understand there was a session earlier this morning about fidelity being the F word in some context. I was not in the session. The students were. It sounds like at least one audience member was as well. We here at the evaluative team for PBIS take that F word very seriously. We say it all the time. But it's not that F. Come on, people. It's not that F word. It's fidelity. What we're about to share from here until the very end is only data, or our only data, from schools in which we can independently confirm that they were installing Tier 1 or advanced tiers with fidelity. With fidelity, which means we've got this massive data set of wonderfully rich data, but we can only use the data from schools for which we have corresponding fidelity data. Every time those of you out in the schools, every spring when you're doing that darn fidelity measure, it's not a darn fidelity measure. It is a beautiful thing for us. Because you can give us all the outcome data in the world, but without any fidelity data, those outcome data are useless to us. They mean nothing to us because we cannot verify that the practice was installed as designed. Therefore, fidelity is absolutely critical to us, as it should be for educators in general. Now, again, the data here are reflective of that COVID year that we all want to forget. So we're a few years behind. And also notably, the fidelity instruments during that year were modified, namely the walkthrough that was required or is required for the TFI. Clearly, we weren't walking through buildings when we were under COVID restrictions. So there were some modifications that were permitted during that particular academic year when it comes to monitoring fidelity. So a lot of questions here, but in the interest of time, because we want to make sure that Amber has a chance to get up here as well, here are fidelity data disaggregated by building type as of spring of 2021. Not surprisingly, the largest proportion of schools installing Tier 1 SWPBIS were at the elementary level. I say that not surprisingly because that's the national trend. As well, we have a much larger number of affiliated elementary schools by comparison to the other grade spans. But notably, we have a number of model or demonstration sites installing Tier 1 across those other grade spans as well. By the way, the purple bar is other. That's a hodgepodge of schools that have interesting grade configurations or grade configurations that we don't even know because they are not your typical kind of brick and mortar or typical grade spanned building. Cross-sectionally, you can see here some data. Not surprisingly, with a few minor exceptions, we have a general increase across multiple years. The green bar representing schools achieving full implementation of Tier 1, and the black bars representing schools that are on their way, but not quite there yet, which they need to be applauded for that work as well. When we look at the geographic distribution of schools implementing Tier 1 SWPBIS, I have a map guy who that's his job, is he makes maps. And when I asked him to make the map in different colors, he's like, well, that's not how we do things in map making. And I said, well, for people with visual impairment issues or color blindness, if you have gradations of blue or brown or whatever, it's hard to read. So he made this, and he's like, this isn't part of it. But anyhow, so what we have here is color gradations of the penetration of Tier 1 being installed in various school districts. Yes, everybody's eye is drawn to the geographically largest school district right in the center. I believe that's Bald Eagle School District, which geographically is the largest school district in Pennsylvania, to my knowledge. But anyhow, so that gives us an indication of the penetration, the number of schools installing SWPBIS at Tier 1. Of course, we also want to be mindful of schools that are installing advanced tiers. Here's a representation of schools implementing Tier 1 only, Tiers 1 and 2, 2 criterion, and then Tiers 1, 2, and 3, 2 criterion, of course, using the TFI, Tiered Fidelity Inventory. And notably, we have 60 schools installing Tier 1 and 2, and we have 47 schools installing the comprehensive SWPBIS model. Just to be clear, SWPBIS is a 3-tiered model. It's not just Tier 1. It's a 3-tiered model. So we obviously want to achieve all 3 tiers, and we have demonstrated that 47 schools by spring of 2024 achieved 2 criterion. When we disaggregate those data by building type, both at Tiers 1 and 2, and then also Tiers 1, 2, and 3, here are some lovely visuals for you to consume at another point in time. But generally speaking, not surprisingly, elementary schools represent the largest proportion of schools achieving implementation Tier 1 and 2, as well as achieving all 3 tiers of the framework. with representation in some of our other grade spans. High school, we got to find a high school that has all 3 tiers of SWPBIS installed, at least as the spring of 2021. And I can't remember off the top of my head if we have any high schools for 22-23. I'm looking at the folks who know the data better than I do, but I don't think we do. Yeah, they're like, we don't think so. So if you're in a high school, we'd love to help you figure out how to get all 3 tiers installed so that we can demonstrate high school. This work can be done in a high school. Okay, so now we finally get to the most exciting part, which does not include me, but includes Amber, who's going to talk about outcomes associated with installation. Any questions thus far? Yes.
Dr. Ruby, do you see a lot of schools, or what percentage of schools maybe go back? I'm thinking a lot of the administrative changes, teachers, all of that. What do you see from your lens on that?
Cool. So to summarize, because I was told by our camera person, Mike, that I have to summarize the question. Do we see any evidence of schools falling off the wagon, per se? In other words, they achieve criterion on a fidelity measure for a year or two, and then they don't for a year or two, and then they come back? That's generally the question. The short answer, yes. We actually see a lot of that, more so than I ever actually imagined we would observe. That is a fairly common thing. Now, we cannot tell from our data the reasons for that. Our hypotheses are in line with what you thought: administrative change, building level or central administration, or district leadership like school boards, and their priorities change. Latham in 1988 wrote a wonderful piece on the life and death cycle of educational initiatives, which all of you who have worked in schools, and I was a practitioner for 10 years, know this as well. The typical initiative lasts in a school for 5 years. First year, I was like, ooh, this sounds kind of neat. Years 2, 3, and 4, like gung-ho. And then year 5, see you later, administrator, we're going to move on to something else. That's typically how things happen. Now, I like to think positively, and we are a positive behavior support framework, right? So positively thinking is that we do see a fair number of schools who weather the storm of the change in building, district, leadership, as well as school boards. They are hard to find, but they do exist. And we do have some good data about longevity of installation of SWPBIS, but typically the pattern is 2 to 3 years to achieve criterion. They're there for a year or so, and then year 5, they disappear. And then they reappear at years 7 or 8. That's the typical pattern. Don't do that, please. Just stick with it. Was there another question or comment? Yes.
Yeah, I think the only other thing that we have seen difference is that there's a lot of tier 2, tier 3, but the tier 1 list is where they're struggling.
So to summarize, again, for the interest of our audience who isn't here because they had sock drawers to rearrange or overdue library books, they do well at tier 2 and tier 3, and then they start to kind of wane at tier 1. So those are very interesting schools in our data set. We have a few of those. They're the schools that they have achieved criterion at tier 2 and tier 3, but their fidelity measure at tier 1 is not good. We admire them, but we can't really do anything with their outcome data because if you don't have tier 1 to criterion, I'm not really sure how tier 2 and tier 3 work. But that does happen every year when we aggregate our data. We have a couple of those, I like to call them oddball schools, that seem to have fidelity inverted. They're doing really well at tier 3 and tier 2, but their tier 1 data would suggest that they're not really having a robust universal framework, which frankly, as we all know, lacks the support that kids who need tier 2 and tier 3 services require in order to be successful at tier 1. Like if I'm on a kid on a behavior plan, that'll be great in my special ed classroom, but if my gen ed teachers aren't using it, then I'm not going to fare very well, right? Does this sound familiar? So that is an operationalization of a school that has tier 3 in place and maybe tier 2, but tier 1 is lacking. And so we do see that, again, we can only hypothesize as to why that happens, but there are some schools for which that occurs. And my hope is that they're recognizing the limitation of tier 1 and then revisiting that work from probably 3 or 4 or 5 years ago to bolster tier 1. Good comments, good questions. Any others? Amber has been really patient. All right, we're going to turn it over to Amber.
Okay, now outcomes, as according to Dr. Runge, the glamorous section. So with outcomes, like Dr. Runge stated with fidelity, this is data that has high fidelity. We're only looking at data that has high fidelity with SWPBIS. And as Dr. Runge also stated, this is from the year 2020 to 2021. So there's data that we unfortunately could not look at. So normally we would look at office discipline referrals, out-of-school suspensions, and out-of-school placement across LEAs. Unfortunately, because of COVID, we could not look at those data. But the data we are going to be looking at today is going to include staff perception surveys, outcomes of Tier 2, specifically mild to moderate behavior interventions, or challenges, and then academic accountability data such as the PSSAs and Keystones. Sorry, I had to figure out how to change a slide. So the questions that we're going to be looking at in outcome include, are there desired outcome changes when SWPBIS is implemented with full fidelity? And then so for that, before I get ahead of myself, can include like adult perceptions, specifically like staff perceptions. And then the second question we're going to be looking at is check in, check out, and does it adequately support students behaviorally in schools? And then our third question with outcomes is going to be, is SWPBIS associated with academic achievement and growth outcomes, specifically with the PSSAs and Keystones? So, to start answering that first question of the desired outcome change with SWPBIS, we're going to be looking at the staff perceptions of behavioral supports in schools with SWPBIS. So looking at this graph, the blue is schools who do not implement any SWPBIS tiers, and then the orange is Tier 1, and then so on with Tier 1 and 2 with the gray, and then all 3 tiers with yellow. So what we found by looking at this data is that schools that were not implementing any tiers of SWPBIS had lower teacher perceptions of implementation with fidelity compared to schools who did have SWPBIS regardless of which level. And then we also found that schools implementing Tier 1 of SWPBIS reported statistically significant lower teacher perceptions when compared to schools who had both Tiers 1 and Tier 2 of SWPBIS. It's also important to note that when the tiers are fully implemented, according to the surveys, we found that staff recognize the effort that it takes, but once Tier 1 is fully established, they might not necessarily distinguish the higher levels, like Tier 2 and Tier 3. So moving on with more staff perceptions. So for this, we're looking at the staff perception of school safety. So as we're working in schools, of course, our number one thing is having a safe school and a nurturing environment. Because if we have a safe school and a nurturing environment, it helps create greater academic and behavioral success for students. Now, looking at this one, it's similar to the last graph, whereas the first one is, the first bar would show schools who did not implement any tiers of SWPBIS, and then the green was Tiers 1 and 2, Tier 1, and then Tiers 1 and 2, and then all 3 tiers. So, what we found by this data is that schools who implemented Tier 1, Tiers 1 and 2, and all 3 tiers reported statistically higher average protective factors compared to schools who did not have any tiers. And then we also found that schools who implemented any tier, regardless if it was 1 or 2 or all 3, had similar statistic protective factors. However, due to the data, because we're looking at it, we cannot assume cause and effect, but we can look at the strong relationship between SWPBIS and the tiers and having more supports and protective factors in schools to help prevent school violence. And then what else was interesting about this data is that the schools who had the lowest risk levels were schools that implemented Tier 1 and schools who had Tiers 1 and 2. But what was really interesting for me personally is looking at it was the schools who had no tier implementation and schools who had all 3 levels of tiers for SWPBIS had the highest level of risk. Now, we weren't sure why they had the highest levels and like the same level of risk. But since risk factors are sometimes out of the control of the school and staff, it might be things such as like community factors. Now moving on to that second question of check in, check out, and if it helps students behaviorally. So what is check in, check out? So check in, check out is a tier 2 intervention used for students who want the adult attention. So in the morning, the student would go to a teacher, and then the teacher would talk to the student about expected behaviors that they should be showing throughout the day. And then throughout the day, the student would have a behavioral report card that they'd take to class, and the teachers would, give them a point if they were showing expected behaviors. And then at the end of the day, they would check out with their teacher, from the same teacher as in the morning, and go over how their behavior was during the day. And then they would also calculate those points. And then if they hit a certain amount of points, they would get a reinforcer. And then at the end of the day, the student would take that to their parent guardian and get a signature. Now, the overall goal of check in, check out is to have 80% or more of their daily points for 2 consecutive weeks. So looking at this data from the school year 2008 to 2009 all the way to 2020 to 2021, obviously we saw a very large decrease in schools who implemented check in, check out. However, this was also most likely due to the pandemic. So for 2020 to 2021, there were only 32 elementary schools, 3 middle schools, 1 high school, 2 alternative schools, and 2 other schools, which is much lower than normal because of the pandemic, most likely. And then moving on for check in, check out, looking at the success rates. So for this data, we only looked at elementary schools because we were unsure if there would be any statistical differences across different grade spans. So we looked at elementary schools, and we looked at elementary schools that had 2 or more years of check in, check out data. So because of that, we can't look at the longitude of the data because of its cross-sectional nature. And it's also not appropriate to look at the check in, check out success rate across from year to year because of that. However, if you look at overall the 13 years, the average for the check in, check out success rates was 83%. And then if you look specifically at 2020 to 2021, it was 92% of elementary students enrolled in check in, check out achieved success criterion. And then if you recall, the success criterion was the 80% of daily points for 2 or more consecutive weeks. And then finally, PSSA and Keystone. So we looked at students who achieved proficient or advanced on the Keystones, and then compared it to SWPBIS and tiers. So for this one, we looked not only at tiers 1, 1 and 2, and all 3 tiers, but we also looked at partial implementation of tier 1. However, when we looked at it, there were no significant differences among any of the 4 SWPBIS levels for students who achieved proficient or advanced on the PSSAs or Keystones.
I told you there was going to be a fair amount of data, and I hope we met that objective. But in summary, they did a great job, but just kind of in summary in terms of the outcomes. Again, we were very much limited in our review to data that were not kid-specific, with the exception of check in, check out, and Keystone and PSSAs, because we couldn't look at office discipline referrals, suspension data, out-of-school placements, and the other common metrics that we historically have reviewed in these annual reports. And that is all a product of that COVID year that we all want to forget. Notably, if you come here next year and you see the same session, we'll have all those data to share with you as well, because again, we just finished up our evaluation of the 2022-2023 academic year. What was it, like a month ago we finished that up? So it's not ready for prime time because we had to send it to PDE and Patton for them to review before we could share it to a wider audience, when we anticipate those results will be forthcoming. But notably, in the data that we reviewed here today, I think what you can draw are a couple of conclusions. We got a lot of schools that are affiliated with the PAPBS network, which is a good thing, a very good thing, and we see increasing trends each year. We have a fair to modest number of schools that are installing to criterion. And I'm looking at it from a state level perspective. I'm not minimizing the fact that we have, what, nearly 700 schools to date that have installed Tier 1 SWPBIS. That's a lot. But we also have 6,000 buildings or so in Pennsylvania. So 700 is a fraction, I don't know, I can't do the math that quickly, but it's, we still have opportunities, as Jim Palmero used to describe, problematunities. It's a problem that presents an opportunity for us to install SWPBIS in greater numbers of schools. But we have achieved a lot of schools reaching criterion at Tier 1, and we have 40 or 50 or so schools installing Tiers 1 and 2, and what was it, 47 that had installed all 3 tiers, which is fantastic. But we still have 6,000 or so buildings, which means we got a lot of work to do. For the schools that install SWPBIS at Tier 1 to criterion, we have staff that acknowledge and are consistent in their perception of installation with those fidelity measures. That's a good thing. In other words, teachers know and staff know that they're doing good work. As one of my colleagues from IU8, who retired a number of years ago, Tina Howes, used to say, every once in a while you got to throw the dog a bone. You got to give everybody some positive feedback for the hard work that they're doing. That is very clear in our data that staff know when they are installing SWPBIS. And while that may not directly translate to kids, it's important that staff are aware and recognize the fruits of their labor. And so that we have data that suggests that. Interestingly also, we have data that suggests that the more tiers of SWPBIS you install, the more protective factors you have that are important for buffering kids against the negative things that keep bombarding them from day in, day out. And there seems to be a relationship between installation of SWPBIS and reducing risk factors, although that issue is not particularly as clear because, as Amber noted, some of those risk factors are beyond the control of a school district, like crime, delinquency, poverty. I mean, schools can only play a tiny, tiny role in community matters related to risk factors for kids. Check in, check out, do it. It works. It's really easy. That's the short answer on that one. And that's a high quality, very easily implemented Tier 2 installation, Tier 2 intervention. And then the association between SWPBIS and academic outcomes is far less clear. And I'm not terribly surprised by that, simply because providing behavioral support for kids is not probably going to be the #1 influence on kids' ability to be proficient in ELA and math. Instead, like teaching them ELA and math probably has a much greater effect on their ability to be proficient in those skills. That said, however, we still need supportive environments in which kids feel safe, feel welcomed, feel challenged, and are respected, and then therefore can receive the high quality instruction that teachers are trained to do and are so passionate to do if we can get through those social, emotional, and behavioral barriers that present themselves in classrooms and disrupt the learning environment. Therefore, the lack of a direct linkage between SWPBIS and academic outcomes is not surprising to us, but it is, however, something that we continue to monitor because, as we all know, educational systems are held accountable to academic outcomes. And so that concludes pretty much what we were able to discern from the data from that year that we all want to forget. And again, if you want a more comprehensive review, we encourage you to go to the PAPBS.org website, pull down the executive summary. It's a wonderfully light read. The students are tired of reading because they have to read it like, 7, 8, 9 times to make sure there's no typos. And then when I'm sitting there a few moments ago, I'm like, there's a typo. I'm so mad at myself. But anyhow, so we also have a comprehensive report for the 22-23 academic year that is in review by Pat and PDE, and we anticipate the release of the executive summary sometime after the new calendar year begins. And that's where we're going to revisit the academic year where everybody was fully back, and we have far more student-level outcome data to review, really kind of, again, bringing home the evidence base around the penetration and the outcomes associated with SWPBIS installation. And that said, we still have, by my count, 11 more minutes for Q&A, right? We didn't go overtime, did we, Erica? Okay, good. We're on time. We're good. We're here till 4:15. So questions, comments, 3:15. No, everybody's like 4:15. Holy cow. We really have a lot of time. We could go page by page through the 53 pages of the exec. You don't want to do that. Any questions, comments, raw fruit you want to throw at me or anything like that? Question, yes.
Is it worth it to implement tier 1 if it's not being implemented well?
Excellent question. Is it worth it to implement tier 1 if you're not going to implement it well? Do you know the answer that I'm about to say? Oh, okay, you don't know the answer. All right, because I've said this before, because it came up in some of our earlier data that we didn't share today. Some of our data that we shared in previous years would indicate that if you install tier 1 partially, you actually get worse outcomes. You heard that correct. When we compared schools that were not installing tier 1 at all versus schools that were kind of doing it, like on Thursdays and every day that ended or had a Y in it, no, that's every day, but if you only partially installed tier 1 SWPBIS, some of your outcomes, notably around office discipline referrals and suspension data, was less than ideal. The point here, the take-home message is, if you're going to install tier 1, do it really well, because if you do it half-baked, you might actually do harm. And we found that over a number of different years. We didn't share any of those data here. If you want to review those data, you have to go back a couple of executive summaries, like executive summary for like the 12th year, to 11th year, so a few years back. We have some pretty interesting data around student outcomes regarding discipline and also school safety survey data, which, by the way, the school safety survey is sunsetted. That is no longer available. And in this coming year's annual evaluation, we actually reviewed the school climate survey, which is increasing in popularity. And we would encourage all of you in schools to consider the school climate survey. There is one on the PBIS apps website. I know there's also one that PDE endorses, which is slightly different. But you know, we have some good preliminary data indicating that if you install tier 1 2 criterion, you have a happier climate. Shockingly, right? But yeah, to your question, there are some indicators from a few years back that if you install tier 1 half-baked, if you don't do it fully, then you might actually do harm when it comes to discipline. Your discipline data are actually worse. And think about that. What does that mean? It means that it's inconsistent. And if you know anything about kids with behavioral challenges, the inconsistencies are precisely why they make a lot of behavioral mistakes, right? So if I'm a kid who can code switch and I know exactly how to behave in different environments, I won't get in trouble. If I'm a kid who can't code switch, I'm going to mouth off to you because I don't realize this is not the appropriate time or place for me to mouth off to you, and then I get sent down to the office. So consistency amongst all environments is what's going to support students with significant needs. And when you're half doing tier 1, that means there's a lack of consistency, lots of opportunities for kids to make behavioral mistakes. And I realize I'm using a phrase that maybe not everyone agrees with. I think all kids are born innately to be good people. They just make errors. We all make errors. I make errors. My wife and kids will tell you all the errors I make, which if I were in school would result in an office discipline referral. Ooh, uh-oh. We broke it again. Well, that's for the next group. Other questions or comments? Yeah, go ahead. Be brave.
I think my only question would be,
Look at the data the other way.
with significant disabilities, especially in things like reading, as they get older,
Yep.
the compensation strategies are often, they're manifesting in behavioral issues, right?
Sure.
I'd rather do that than stop.
Yeah.
So I didn't know if you had had a chance to kind of go the other direction and having the focus on where kids who are struggling within the bottom 20% of the group to see where they look at those.
Absolutely. So if I may, again, to the benefit of the audience, both here and virtually, to summarize and help me if I'm a little off base or a lot off base. The question was, both the question and a comment was related to have we been able to look at the data kind of more in at a granular level for students with disabilities to see how that shapes their disciplinary patterns? No, I misunderstood.
Kind of anything scoring in that bottom 20 percentile, below the 20 percentile on the PSA or PSA, which could be students with disabilities.
Gotcha. So, yeah, in other words, is there traction or movement or improvement in PSSA Keystone performance for the lowest quartile or the lowest category. What is that, below basic? Yeah, below basic, right? Basic and the below basic, yeah, sorry. So that would speak to PBIS. And we do look at PBIS. We didn't look at it at that year because that was the COVID year, so we don't really have PBIS. Because remember, the spring before that, like the world took a sharp right turn at Albuquerque and no one took the PSSA or Keystone. So we have reintroduced the PBIS analysis in the current evaluative report that we're finalizing. And so that would give us some insight, and I don't want to speak off of memory as to what the results were, but I know we did look at that. And we can only do that for academic proficiency. We can't look at any of the discipline data relative to students with disabilities because all the data come to us de-identified for, I hope you understand, very obvious reasons why we don't know individual kids or their exceptionalities if those are relevant. So we can't discern it at that granular level. But that is absolutely something that individual schools and districts could consider looking at because I think that would be very informative. You're absolutely right. The older you get, and the worse you are at an academic skill, you create all sort of inventive behaviors to get out of engaging in the academic work, right? To either save face or to avoid it. Those are all wonderfully effective and efficient escape or avoidant behaviors. We all call them problematic behavior that gets you thrown out of class. I would say that's a very effective way of getting away from doing the academic work. Not that it's the right way, it's just very effective. Other questions or comments? All right. Well, it's 3:11, and I think there's some final concluding comments from Erica. But thank you all again for coming.
Yes, let's thank our presenters from IUP for all the work they've been doing for all these years on the executive summary. So thank you so much for joining this session and your questions and your comments and your interest in the executive summary.